Hello, this is Mrs. Kohler. I know you were probably missing the smileys lately, so I'm going to make one for you. There's your smiley. And actually later on in this unit we'll actually be working with the genetics of some smileys, so get used to seeing them again. So in this unit we're going to talk about genetics. Now this guy on the front here, his name is Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a monk, and he was the first person to really describe how genetics is done. So first we're going to talk about this monk named Gregor Mendel. Who was he exactly? Well, he was known as the father of genetics, and he's the person that discovered how traits are inherited. So the first term you need to know is genetics. Genetics is just the study of heredity. And heredity is how traits are passed from parent to offspring. So how you inherit the things that make you you from your mom and your dad. Down here you can see a picture of Mendel, and he's actually working in his garden. Now, when Mendel did his experiments, these are actually pea plants, and he did his experiments using seeds of peas. So here you can see two pea plants. This one's tall right here, and this one is short. That's one of the traits that he studied when he looked at pea plants. So pea plants have a lot of different traits. For instance, they can be either tall or short, or they can have purple flowers or white flowers. And if you look down here, there's some other traits that he looked at. Took some plants, and some of them he self-fertilized. So self-fertilized means that the plant pollinated itself. For others, though, he took the pollen from one plant and put it in the flower of another plant. And that was called cross-fertilization, because you were taking flowers from one and pollinating them with pollen from another. So one of the experiments that Mendel did was he took a plant that had purple flowers and he mated it with a plant that had white flowers. Now, according to the theory at the time, if you took purple and white, you would end up with light purple. So that's what he was expecting to see. So, but when he mated the purple with the white, he got all purple, which seems kind of weird to him. He was expecting a blend. So the first surprising things was that the offspring weren't a blend of the parents. They all showed the characteristic of one parent, but not the other. And he took these plants, which were called the F1 generation, and he crossed them with each other. So he took the brothers and sisters from this first batch and mated them with each other to see what would happen. And when that happened, the white reappeared. And he noticed that 1 out of every 4 pea plants came out white. He did this with thousands of plants. And after he'd done it thousands of times, he came up with some general rules that no one had discovered before. So the rules that Mendel came up with explained why this happened with the flowers. So the first thing he decided was that each trait, and a trait is any characteristic that can vary, so that's your definition. Each trait has different forms called alleles. And based on his observations, he concluded that every organism has 2 alleles for a trait. So in other words, in these flowers, there were 2 places where they could have a spot for flower color, and each spot could have either a purple gene or a white gene. Now, the reason in that first generation they all came out purple was that some alleles, remember an allele is a form of a gene, some alleles are dominant. And he said a dominant gene is always going to be expressed. So in this case, he thought that purple was the dominant gene because when you crossed purple with white, you always got purple. And take note that this is symbolized by a capital P. A dominant trait is always symbolized by a capital letter, and it's usually the first letter of the word. So purple, that's dominant, is capital P. And then he decided some alleles were recessive. Recessive means that if there's a dominant one present, the dominant one's going to cover it up. So recessive can be covered up. And in this case, he decided that white was recessive. Now note that since he used a capital P for the dominant gene, for the recessive gene, he uses the lowercase form of the same letter. So even though this is white and white starts with W, you're using a lowercase p because the dominant form is purple. So you use the lowercase letter of the dominant form. Now to explain why this happened, Mendel said that the first generation, which is called the F1 generation, and it's this right here, he decided that the first generation probably got a dominant gene from its purple parent and a recessive gene from its white parent. But since there's only one recessive gene, it got covered up by this dominant gene, and that's why they were all purple. But then in the second generation, which is called the F2 generation, which is this one right here, some of the flowers got a recessive white gene from each parent, and that's why the white reappeared. So those ones that were white had 2 lowercase p's, or 2 of the recessive white genes. Now, the parents from the original generation, in other words, these up here, they're from what's called the P generation, P for parent, were considered to be pure breeds because always before, whenever you crossed a purple plant with a purple plant, it made all purple flowers, and whenever you crossed a white with a white, they always made white flowers. So they were considered pure breeding. I'm going to make a Harry Potter analogy. Think about the wizarding world and think about the Malfoys. They were wizards that always married wizards, so the Malfoys were what you would consider pure breeds. Another way of saying pure breed is homozygous, which means 2 of the same allele, and homo means same. So homozygous, 2 of the same. So homozygous would be either 2 capital P's or 2 lowercase p's. So either 2 purple genes or 2 white genes. But the offspring, which is this generation, were called hybrids because the parents had different traits. So they are heterozygous. Hetero means different. It means they have 2 different alleles. So going back to the Harry Potter analogy, sometimes you had a wizard that had a wizard parent and a muggle parent. They would be heterozygous or hybrids. And here there's a capital P and a small p, or a purple gene and a white gene. And in this case, when there's one of each, you're going to see the dominant trait. So all of these were big P, little p. And because they each had a dominant gene, that's the one that you saw. So all of these had a gene for white flowers, but they were all covered up by the gene for purple flowers. And what we know now is that when a parent makes sperm or eggs, their genes are going to separate. And we talked about this during meiosis, where you start out with 2 of each chromosome, and by the end you only have 1 of each chromosome. So experiments on meiosis explained the discoveries that Mendel did. And the reason that every organism has 2 alleles for every gene is that there's 2 sets of chromosomes. One from mom and one from dad. And remember, those are homologous chromosomes. So those homologous chromosomes each carry a gene. And depending on whether the organism gets dominant or recessive alleles depends on what the organism looks like. So you're getting 1 from the egg and 1 from the sperm. Thanks for joining me for this podcast today. Don't forget to do your review sheets that go along with this and take your quiz, and see you in the next podcast.